Well, hello and welcome everybody. This is I believe it's our fourth webinar in the series. We're going to be covering today FarmQA Analytics. This is a new feature within our program that is really pulling together a lot of the data sets that we have that have been collected through our solution. And we're rolling that up and showing you how you can analyze that data within FarmQA. So the actual title here is How Analytics Can Transform Your Service Offering. I'm Ben Munson. I'm the Senior Technology Specialist here at FarmQA, and I'll be walking you through the product. So just a very brief recap. So what we do is we build digital tools for agronomy. We started with a crop scouting platform that morphed into bringing in recommendation writing. We brought in map layers, which we covered in last week's webinar. Feel free to go back and watch that on YouTube. Right now, we're talking about the analytics portion, which has also been built here in the last 6 months, but is really where we're going with the product is being able to provide analytics on the data sets already in the program. So we'll mostly cover this through a live web demo is the plan, but you can just see here the high level concepts are you can set up metrics on things like your scouting reports. So questions like stand counts, plant populations, weed counts, you can track those as what we call metrics, which will then feed into our analytics type graphs, which you see here on the left. So we put you as a customer, you as a user in the driver's seat for defining the items that you're going to want to see in more of a rolled up type of a view. And then you can manipulate what those views are, whether it's graphical based, whether it's a spatial view with either heat maps or field averages. And we'll get into all those different options and we'll unpack that here in the next half an hour. So that's at a very high level what we're talking about when we say analytics and what that means to us currently. So we'll just dive in, and I think the product will speak for itself here as far as functionality. So at this point, you should be seeing my screen, and we're bringing up what we call Munson Farms. This is my demo data, and we're on the web view currently. And we have the field boundaries delineated, displayed in FarmQA. But what I'm going to walk through here is how we set up what we call those metrics. And then we're also going to walk in, spend most of the time and step into this analytics tab you see here on the left-hand side, which is really where we start to show that data set on more of a rolled up type of a view. So first of all, what are analytics and how do we set them up? So we're going to walk through the first and kind of the main type that we currently have, which would be setting up a metric on a scouting question. So what we're doing is I'm clicking on the scouting tab, and within here I have all my reports, but I also have a templates tab. This is where you can see all of my templates. Now, when I say previously I said scouting, but this could be any sort of generic form you might want to create to collect data. So it could be something like a soil sampling template, a tillage template like you can see down here, or like I'll be walking through more of a traditional scouting situation where you have things like you're looking at insects, diseases, and weeds. What I'm showing right now is the template designer, and I covered the details of this in the second webinar when we walked through the product and scouting a little more. So if you want more details on how to manipulate this, that would be the webinar for you. But today I'm going to point out a very specific function within this designer. So if I jump over to, for example, the insect tabs, you'll see that there's icons displayed on several of these insects like spider mites and aphids, and this means that they are currently being tracked as a metric. So a metric, as we said, is going to be something that feeds into the dashboard or analytical view, and we can define these metrics on the template. So right now these four are being defined currently, but what I'm going to step through is how do we create a new metric. I'll draw your eyes to the bottom right here where you can see the metric setup. This is a new function within the product where you'd see this with this feature turned on within your account. And what I've done is you can see spider mites is being tracked with this question. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to jump over to the weeds tab, and I wanted to show in this case how do we set up a new metric on something like kochia is one of our weeds. So in my case, I have kochia set up as a pick list, meaning that on the right hand side, when I answer this or I'm in the field scouting, I would get this drop-down list of options to assess the severity of an infestation. But within this, what I'm going to do at the very bottom is I'm going to track this kochia question as a metric. So all I do is I check that box, and now I get two options. I can use an existing metric definition, or I can create a new metric definition, which is what I want to do in this case. And I'll step through here in a second how we could use that existing metric, but this is the first time that I've set up kochia as a metric within my account, so that's why I'm using the new option. We auto-populate here the metric name and the metric category. However, you can edit this. So if you wanted this to be a specific metric, to say kochia found in cornfields, you could delineate that or type that in and save that. But in my case, I do want to keep that as just kochia as is. So now you see, once I've done that, I get this icon. So that is just a quick reference for knowing that that is set up as a metric definition. Now, a few other options I want to show you here is I'm going to jump into the plant population, which is a numeric metric that I'm going to create. From this screen, this will look identical to what the previous one did that was a pick list option, but they will look different when we get into the analytics tab. So for now, I'm just going to choose to create a new metric, and again, this is going to be a new metric definition, but I'm going to leave this, well, actually maybe I will call this corn, since the plant populations, this range would be specific to corn. And then I wanted to create a brand new question and show you just one last option here as far as the setup. So if I want a new question here, I'm going to call this seed depth. This is something we're going to answer at the beginning of the season, and I'll just say that this is in inches. Now this question is created, and I will set this up as a new metric, but because it's a new question, I need to name it. So I'll call it seed depth. And at this point, I've created the definitions, but they're not actually in the analytics side until I click save. So we always need to make sure we save this template, which I'm going to do here in the top right. So we hope we made that easy to create those metrics. It's within the template view, you select them and then make sure to save the template. One last thing I want to show on the setup side would be that scenario where I'm going to use an existing metric. So what I've done now is I've come into my soybean template, and when I click on insects here and spider mites, now I know that I have a spider mite question set up in that corn template that I just showed you. So what I'm going to do in this case when I define my metric is I'm going to use, instead of creating the new like I did previously, I'm going to use existing. And then we simply get a drop-down list of those existing metrics that have been created. And I see spider mites is in the system already, so I'm going to select that. Now what this does is by using the same metric across templates, that will use the same pipeline into the dashboard. So if you're assessing spider mites in corn versus soybeans versus maybe hops, you're going to be getting the same output, or you can get those displayed on the same grid or graph within the analytics view because they're tracked as one metric. Okay, so again, I'm going to save that, and what we'll walk through now is a couple things. So I'm actually going to scout, and the reason being is that on the previous corn template, I created a couple of new questions, the seed depth question, and I just want to showcase how that data feeds in to the analytics view. So I've jumped over to the scouting app very briefly, and I'm going to come into a field here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use field 32, and we'll just use that for reference when we're looking at the analytics graph to know that we're looking at this new set of data. So I'm within this field. Sorry, I do need to sync this because I did make some changes to my template. So I came into settings, I'm doing a sync now. We do auto sync, but in this case, these are very quick changes that I'm making. I want to make sure I have the latest versions of the templates. Now I click on the field and I'm using my corn template. And now we see within plant conditions, I have the seed depth question. That's that new question I set up with a metric. And we're going to say this seed depth was at 2 inches. And I'm just going to key in a plant population value here. Okay, so that's been created, and then I was also working with the kochia question, so I'm going to answer this as very high. Okay, at this point, I'm going to submit the report, And from the scouting side, there's really nothing significant you have to do differently to get these metrics to work. You simply continue to scout as you've always done in the product, and that data will automatically flow into our metrics view. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is we're going to finally get into the analytics tab. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is the analytics view, and there's 4 different tabs within this view that we can step through here. The first is the dashboard. So this is where we are displaying all of your predefined, pre-created dashboards, metric graphs saved into a dashboard type of a view. So this is going to be kind of a go-to at a glance, what's going on today or right now. And what I've done is I've set up an aphid graph, but this is severity by fields, aphid pressure. This is the field averages map, so it's more of a spatial view of where we have aphid pressure. And then I have a spider mite graph showing data over time. So these are just types of graphs that we can work with, and I will certainly unpack this here and show how we can create these. Stepping through the rest of the tabs here. So what I'm actually going to do is I will click on the metrics tab, and we'll show you that this is where we house all those metrics that we've defined within those scouting templates. So if you recall, kochia was a new question that I decided to track as a metric, and we see it listed here. We can manipulate this, so if we do want to now change this into a corn-specific kochia assessment, we could do that and save it, change the category, things like that. The other thing to note, and I'll circle back to this at the end, but the sources for metric right now, we're using the scouting reports that are coming through. We can also bring in metrics from map layers. What that means is if you have a spatial data set, maybe it's fertility data or it's yield data, and there's attributes within, for example, a shapefile, we could use those attributes to automatically create metrics within FarmQA. So in other words, think of maybe you want to get a yield value per field. You could import those yield maps that have that attribute defined, and then that will populate into our analytics view. We're adding to this list of what things can contribute to metrics, scouting reports, map layers, and then fertility be the next big one. So lab data can come through as well. The last thing to point out from this view is that in this case, the weeds or the kochia question was set up as a pick list option. And what I can do over here is I can change what colors we're going to paint the map or per field when we, for example, see a very high kochia assessment. So in my case, I might want to turn this red, whereas the none and low would be, in my head, I would think traditionally good. So I'm going to mark this as green, and we can have different shades of green, as you can see here. So these are all things that can be manipulated, and it happens through this metric tab where we can set up this type of gradient. And I'll leave this as is for now, but you can see how that gets changed, and I'll save that. We got to make sure we save and get that metric save flag to know that those colors will get taken into account. Now I will show you, for example, we were working on the seed depth question, and what you'll see here is this is the same middle section, but what we do have is over here we have the numeric option. So this is a seed depth question I ran 0 to 5 inches. And the options we have here is we can change the range from this metric view if we want. In my case, I'm going to keep it the same, but we can choose a color ramp in this case. So in other words, if I have my seed depth question and we're trying to color from the map view a field to say fields that are planted at 0 inches or maybe half an inch need to be red, and the ones that are planted deeper at a better range, you could have those be green. So that's where you could use that red-green color scale. You can see we have other options in here. So there's a data set that would make sense to run it just a red color scheme with different shades representing different good or bad scenarios. You can choose that. I'm going to just keep this as red, yellow, green. We can invert this. So if, for example, maybe we're working with an aphid pressure scenario, which is actually a good scenario. So if we look at is that scenario, we may want to have red be on the representing the higher numbers. So we could invert this scale, and that would provide green meaning low, red meaning high, opposed to keeping that uninverted, we get the opposite scale. Okay, so that's where you can still manipulate these metrics even after they've been created from the templates. So you can do that at any time. Now, getting into really the meat and potatoes of the analytics here, we're going to start out with the report graph. So what you're looking at here is this is a representation of all the metric data that you've defined. So in this case, every column is representing a metric. So that, for example, the seed depth question or the aphid severity is showing up within here. And then our rows are being represented by fields. So you can see this column here. In my demo data set, I have my fields are numeric names. That's what you're seeing being represented here. Now, a few basic things to know about this view is that we can do a couple things. I like to, you can see it says here, drag a column header to group its columns. So I like to group by crop. So I'm going to drag and drop that up here. And now what you see happen is we had a pivot in this graph, and we see canola, beets, barley, etc. are grouped up here. I can choose to collapse those. Maybe I'm only interested in corn. And now I can see all of my corn fields are being grouped together in this graph. Now, another thing that you could do to get down to a specific view that you might be interested in at a given time would be coming up to this columns section. What we can do in this case is we can actually turn on and off different columns that we might not be interested in. So in my case, if we're looking at maybe we don't care about some of this weed data, and we can turn off those weeds as columns. So once I do that, I also turn off growing season, so you know that you can see that goes away. And then we're left with a view that's maybe more cleaned up to whatever assessment you're trying to make at a given time, or maybe this is looking back end of season what happened. But regardless, we have a data set that we can work with. We're looking at things like aphid counts, which I've filled out for most of my fields to showcase this feature, but I can now sort this. So if I want to say, show me the fields that had the highest aphid pressure throughout the season. Now we see this Wade's field bubble to the top to say that was the highest threshold. I ran this as a numeric 0 through 100 of percent damage. Clearly, you know, these numbers are made up, but you get the concept of showcasing which fields you may need to focus on. And then within this view, the aphid severity was a pick list option. So you could see, for example, which fields had low, medium, high pressure for aphid severity. As we scroll through here, you'll note that you can see things like growth stage. If I would populate this for more fields, you would see that show up. But then if you remember, I did an assessment for seed count. We were looking at populations. So what I'll do is I will clear out everything else except for that. And then you can see how that was data that I just entered as part of this demo into the mobile application. And we're seeing that data populate over here. So that field 32, if you recall, I said that was a 50,000 stand count. And then I also showed the seed depth was 2 inches. So that data automatically flows into this graph and populates here. I'll turn on a few other options here so we can see the full data set again. What you can do from this view is you can search. So if I wanted to say, just show me data from field 32, that snaps down. Additionally, if I just wanted to see my corn fields, I could search that, click enter, and now as I view this, it's just those corn fields. Note that at the bottom, we are averaging. So if we look at things like your aphid count, you can see across all my corn fields, you can see what that average aphid count was, along with any of those other columns as well. So you can see the average being 47.83, and then wireworms, I did the same assessment, numeric ranges. So that's also a view that's automatically provided. Note that within here, we also can sort within the individual columns. So if we're looking at aphids, and I have this sorted, but what I want to do now is maybe filter down. So because this is a numeric metrics, I can say, show me all the fields that have aphid counts that are greater than 50% damage. Now we see that within corn. I could do this across all fields if I want to maybe clear my filter out and see, okay, here's across all my fields, regardless of crop, here's what my aphid pressure is, ranked kind of highest to lowest, but we're only showing values that are 50 or higher. Note that you can also do a combination of these to say, show me fields that have aphid pressure greater than 50, but spider mites less than 20. And you can see I have a small subset of those fields that meet those criteria. So if you're looking at something like maybe an insect pressure versus a beneficial, you could be comparing those in one view. The other thing to note from this particular grid is that we can export to Excel. So if I do that, you can see how quickly it spits out in Excel form. And now we can see all that same data, but presented in Excel, which you could further manipulate, run pivot tables on, etc. Going into the next view within our analytics tab, you can see the metric designer. So this is a place where we see a user manipulating and creating those types of graphs that we saw on the dashboard. And so what I've done here, or what you see, is if I click this drop down, I've pre-created a couple of different views for, in this case, aphids and spider mites. So this aphid graph, what you're looking at here is I'm choosing to, first of all, choose my metric, which was aphids. I can select my farming unit. So if I want this to be grower farm field, I can select what entity to show. And then additionally down here, I can choose crops. So what I'm showing in this case happens to be aphid pressure in my corn fields. And then I'm grouping this by fields itself. And that's why you see all these listed out below. The last thing we can do down here is we can show annotations. So this would be things like when were recommendations made and when were they applied. So you can see those represented by these black dots, which can be hovered over to see the details of those spray events. Now, a couple things we can do here is, well, I should take one step back. So the other thing, once we pick the metrics and the fields, etc., that we want to display, we then choose what type of graph we want to display. So in this case, this is a line graph, but we'll also walk through things like our heat maps, field averages, range charts, etc. And then the other thing to note is that you can pick your time frame. So what I've done is I've picked a custom time frame. Given that we're later in the season here, I wanted to show a data set that represented in-field activity. So I simply keyed in a date, but you could use any one of these predefined date filters as well. Okay, so to start to play with this, you can see I'm going to continue on with the aphid data set, but you can see here if I wanted to just show my ND farm, I've removed Minnesota farm from that view, and the graph renders again with just that data set. Within this view, we can see the color coding. Field 341 is represented by that blue line. But within this, you can actually turn off fields at any given time. So if you do want to break this down and just see a subset of these fields, you can see that represented, and the graph will redraw here as we clear out data sets. So you can always manipulate the map itself or the graph. Maybe this is an aphid count, but you want to pull out anything that's actually been sprayed, given that that wouldn't be relevant for looking at maybe a spray recommendation in the future. So you could pull those fields out from this view. Additionally, we could do that same thing here if you wanted to do a search. You could search for field 49 and then pull that one out, for example. So those searches would apply as well. Moving through here, I'm just viewing the corn crop, but what you can see is that we can also, and I'll come back to the crop view, but going through these group by dimensions, we can also group this by farm. So you saw I was previously working with this North Dakota farm and Minnesota farm. We can now see how those compare to each other as it pertains to aphid pressure. The other thing we can do is view this by crop. You'll note that this will only be a single line, and that's because I only have corn selected here. But if I come through and select some other crops, you can see how those also get drawn on this view. And there's a lot to look at here, but we could also clean this up to say maybe we just want to look at corn versus soybeans. And there you go. Now you have a graph that's showing the comparison view of aphid pressure in our potatoes versus the corn versus the soybeans. Same thing would go with a varietal view. This could get a little more complicated if you have a lot of varieties, but in my case, just looking at corn, I've got half a dozen varieties here, and you get, again, a representation of that. The other thing that we will step through here would be their views that we provide. So besides line charts, we can get into a heat map view. So what I'm going to actually do here, instead of manipulating this data set, I can also jump down into one of these other pre-created views. So I'm going to go to my aphid pressure map, and in this case, I've already created and set up. In this case, you notice that it's all crops. I've selected all my units, and again, it's that aphid question. But what's different about this is that I have the field averages map selected, and what this does is, if you remember back to those metric colors, this is painting the fields a certain color based on whatever the numeric was. So you can see these are aphid values, and the green fields I have set up to be low count, so the field average, that would be the value for the field, whereas the red field might be 100% damage, something like that. So you can actually click through and see those values. Now, another thing that's providing a significant value from this map view is that what I'm showing now is just a snapshot in time. But if I instead want to go to maybe the previous 12 months, now what this view is providing me is and I can change the map layer type as well. This is going to provide what we call a PIP, or a line per week. And so as I step through here, you can see which fields were assessed that week, and that's going to be represented. The other thing that I was talking about before is that there's a heat map option. So that would also color on top of this map. And let me just do a refresh. We should just be getting the heat map view now. But that would display, and while this is loading, I like to think of heat maps as more of a field specific view. So if we were to come in here, look at the field averages map, and I'll turn on all my crops to get back to a similar view. But then we have, like I said, these lines, or what we call pips, showing per week. And so we can go back and show week by week what field had pressure. You can actually play this. I didn't show this before, but it'll actually step through week by week where you saw aphid pressure. You can note here coming up later in July, I did an assessment on all the fields, so you see that being blown out and visualized. But going back to the heat map view, so there we go. That's what I was hoping to show. You can see where you have concentrations of aphids in this case. And if I zoom in, I like to use this view when we're talking more field-specific assessments. So you can see where within a field you saw aphid pressure, and you can actually get into a point where you can select or click on an observation to see, just like we had before, the values within that field. So that is the heat map view. Continue to step through here. Those are kind of a lot of the primary views. We do have, if we want to go into a question where we have something like, let's see here, we'll go with growth stage. That gets displayed as a bar chart. So in this case, what we're seeing here is that across all my fields, and in this case, we'll just view cornfields, we can see what percentage of my fields on September 7th were at V2 versus V3. So you can see the distribution there between whatever we set up. So in this case, you can see the corn versus the soybeans, etc. So that would be the bar chart option within here. Now, the other thing to note is going back to the dashboard. So with any one of these views that we do end up creating is we can, let me go back to aphids in this case, we can save these, and once we do, so I'll go to this, just a heat map view, and maybe we want a specific time window, we can then save that, and this is what's getting pushed into the dashboard. So we'll save this as our aphid graph, and we have the option to let others view this. So if you're a consultant, if you're a retailer, you can pre-create these views, and then your growers will be able to see them just for their operation. So I'll save this, and then note that we can also create new views. So I have 3 options displayed here, but if I want a different view, now I'm starting from scratch, and I could do something like maybe my wireworm pressure across all my organizational units in corn. And this graph isn't all that interesting, but we can show how it can be saved. Let's see if I can show it by farm. You can see how it can be saved as a new unit called wireworm pressure graph. Now when we save this and we go back to the dashboard, you'll see that that is a new option that I didn't have previously from this dashboard view showing up down here. Note, from this view, we can still use those sliders to show data over time from the dashboard. You can zoom in on the maps. You can toggle on and off different map options. The other thing I should point out is that when you're in any of these views, whether it's dashboard, report, or metrics view, you can always grab your organizational unit and it will just show that subdivision of your operation. And I don't have any data in Farm B, but the concept would be the same there. Two other places to show metrics, so that kind of covers that analytics tab, which is the bread and butter of the feature. But the other thing that we can do is, if you're back on this map view, and if you recall, I use this field 32 for answering a few questions that I created. But you can see that there's a new section within the field details that's going to show you your metrics. So this is showing your aphid severity week over week. This is something like your aphid graph, which you could display. We're putting XY axes on these, but then you can also just scroll through here to see any one of your inputs that you had that you previously entered as a metric. The other place it's going to show up, or the last place rather, is if you are on a report view. So actually, I'm going to go back to a report that has a little bit more data in it. So once we click on a report and it loads here, we'll see an icon next to the questions that are going to represent the metrics, which would allow us to see the metrics within a scouting report view. Oops, it just came up there. There we go. So you can see, in this case, I had stand counts, spider mites, things like that. So I could actually click to see in this field what were the historic aphid pressure. There you go. That's a more interesting graph. You can see the aphid pressure over time and hover over these icons to actually see those values over time. So again, if you're viewing report by report and see, okay, well, this is maybe 26% damage now, or maybe 57 in this case, what has that been historically in this field? And you can see where you've come from there. So that was a lot to unpack with you guys, but that is our analytics feature. It is currently in beta, and we're releasing it here for the general public coming up, and that's why we're doing this webinar series, is actually to promote this analytics view. That's a new function that we're offering. And if you have any questions, we'll answer those in the chat now. Otherwise, feel free to send us emails at info@farmqa.com. Email me directly, benmunson@farmqa.com, and we'd be happy to get you set up, showcase this with some of your own data. All right, that's it for today. I do want to highlight that we have one more webinar coming up, and that will be on kind of a catch-all. So it's going to be covering a lot of other smaller features, but collectively they add up to be significant within the product. Things like our corn yield estimator. We have navigation type features to get to fields, and we'll be walking through a handful of those with you next week.